Today I read the Amazing Spider-Man Omnibus. This is a collection of Spider-Man comics from the 80s. So there's a lot of different stories in here, and I read 3 of them. Do you want me to take that? So the first story I read was featuring the villain Mesmero. This is the cover. And as you can tell from his extremely subtle name, his superpower is like mesmerizing people and like hypnotizing them. So I feel like in all of these 3 stories, I got to see a very interesting, almost uncharacteristic side of Peter Parker, because he's dealing with a lot of hatred from the public. And you'll see in all of these stories multiple times when he's actually helping people, they'll like say mean things to them, they'll say mean things to him, they won't be grateful, and I think he feels really unappreciated. And I like that in this first story, we open up with him in his civilian form. He's watching a Broadway show that Mesmero is putting on with his girlfriend, Debbie. And so he's as a civilian. And it's really interesting because Mesmero was I believe, an X-Men nemesis. But here he's like trying to like go on the straight and narrow, but he's not really, because his entire Broadway show consists of like hypnotizing people on stage without their consent, and then when they wake up they're like really embarrassed, and it's pretty grotesque. And everybody who watches the show agrees, and it gets like panned in the Globe. So he has really strong feelings about that. And then we get introduced to this like moral issue because Mesmero discovers that Spider-Man is in the theater because there's a fire, and Peter puts it out because he's a good Samaritan. And he says to the theater, like, you know, Spider-Man's in the audience, he should come find me afterwards because I have a mutually profitable offer for him. So taking money from a villain, even a villain who's quote-unquote reformed, doesn't really fall in line with the traditional superhero narrative. But Peter Parker thinks, like, you know, Aunt May has really big medical bills, obviously he's poor, he's juggling a lot, so he's gonna go do it, which feels a little bit out of character, and I thought that was really interesting. And as Peter and his girlfriend are leaving the theater, there's this guy, I presume a drug dealer, who says like, "Psst, kid, want to buy something terrible?" which isn't at all relevant to the plot, but it does show up again at the end. And to me, I interpreted that as just like another representation of potentially corrupting forces from the outside world, because Peter Parker is a very human character. He is a very good person, but it doesn't come necessarily naturally to him. He is on the younger side. He's not like in high school in these stories, but he has to deal with these kinds of temptations. So I thought it was interesting the way that was subtly placed as like another world-building method to add to that theme. So he does end up meeting Mesmero. And he says, like, "I'll give you $400 a week to do like a 15-minute specialty in my show." And he agrees to take the money, which really surprised me, but I suppose like Mesmero hasn't really done anything illegal or bad yet, and I think Peter Parker is justifying it via like helping Aunt May, which does feel more in character for him. So, but then Mesmero does actually go back to his old ways, and he hypnotizes the critic who wrote really poorly about his show into jumping off of the Brooklyn Bridge. Of course, Spider-Man saves him, but we discover, obviously, he's not really reformed at all, which you could kind of tell right from the beginning. And I think that does like challenge Peter Parker's moral compass again. So he goes to meet Mesmero like he agreed, but interestingly enough, he does take the money that he's giving him, which again did shock me, but I think that's kind of the point of this story, that Peter Parker did something that he wasn't quote-unquote supposed to do, and it backfired. He takes the money and it like electrocutes him, and he wakes up and it's like he's being attacked by Mesmero on stage, and it's a whole thing. That part is less interesting to me than the moral arc of this story. It ends, all is well, Spider-Man defeats him, of course, classic superhero story, he wins. But what's interesting to me is that we see a lot of personal aspects of Peter Parker's life and how he's letting down the people in his life because he can't manage everything. And we see him deal with temptation. And the aspects of him being like hated by the public, him letting down his girlfriend because like he's standing her up because he has like last minute superhero business. You see that in all of these stories. So I feel like at this time, it was a very different characterization of Spider-Man. He's not just good. You know, he's a lot more human. Because in the next story, which has Fusion as the villain, it opens with him helping after there's like a pileup on a bridge. And so he goes and he reorganizes the cars. And instead of saying thank you, all the people are like, well, now we can't get our insurance claims done because you moved the cars, so thanks a lot. And he's like, okay, well, why did I even bother helping? Because I helped, they're ungrateful, and now I'm late to work. So he's also a really interesting thing is that as he's swinging away, the people on the bridge complaining about him, somebody says, probably a commie, which really places this in like the historical context at the time. I thought that was like a really interesting note. And then we are put into this like research particle accelerator situation, which is how like Fusion, the villain, gets formed. And something that I also noticed in all three of these stories is they're sort of in a transitional phase between the really early like 1960s era corny dialogue in a superhero comic where it's really just about the action, the punching, and the fighting. And there's a lot of like, why I oughta get you, like that kind of really vintage vibe. And here, there is still some corny dialogue. There is still a lot of like expository like writing, but they are beginning to introduce more complex like moral and like thematic plots as well that feels like that we see a lot more of in modern day comics. So I really appreciate being able to witness sort of the evolution of the art form, and this sort of has like the best of both worlds in that sense. For example, a bit of corny dialogue. So there's like this scientist who runs the research facility, and he's talking about like how I can create new elements with this accelerator, it's gonna be great. I should wait until it has been safety checked, but surely nothing can go wrong. Very subtle foreshadowing, of course. Naturally, things go wrong. So it turns out that his twin brother works as a janitor at the plant, and immediately it's like the scientist brother is making fun of the other brother for only being a janitor, and they're twins, and it's like you see like they're very different people. Basically, particle accelerator goes off, there's a big mistake, scientist gets knocked out, his brother goes to help him, and they fuse into one person, hence fusion, and they become like this glowing villain energy thing. So the fusion starts like rampaging the streets of New York. Spider-Man tries to stop him. Nothing is working though because the villains are like consuming energy and then expelling it, so we can't really fight him in a typical way. What's really interesting, of course, is that it's literally a Jekyll and Hyde situation because the two twins, like, they still sort of have like the ability to speak separately, but they're one person, so it's kind of complicated. But you have one twin who's like, this is wrong, like, we need to stop, we're hurting people. And the other scientist twin who's like, no, we need to go to like the nuclear power reactor and become the most powerful that we can be. So it's literally like presenting the two sides of morality in a very like clear way. I think it's a powerful plot device. So Spider-Man manages to apprehend him with the help of the good twin, actually. He wouldn't have been able to do it on his own, which I think is important as well because it shows that he's not all-powerful, and it also shows that human aspect of superheroing. I created a verb. So he manages to split the twins, knocks them out, and like apprehends them in that way because they lose their power when they're separated. So once again, that like morality theme, which I think is really interesting because Peter Parker is constantly being tempted. In the same issue, there's a new like editor-in-chief for the Daily Bugle, and he's like basically telling Peter Parker to like fabricate news stories to get like more readership, and he does refuse to do it. But I have to wonder if there is a bit of like some moral wavering where he does consider it for a second, because I feel like we saw that in the previous one. And then the last one I read was about Kraven the Hunter. And similar to Mesmero, he starts off this issue like wanting to be a reformed villain, except he seems to actually want to do it. It's his girlfriend Calypso who eggs him on, basically. And it was very like a la Lady Macbeth. I felt like she was challenging his masculinity and basically like pressured him and sort of convinced him into like fighting Superman. Superman wins, but what I think is really interesting is the emphasis on like a villain trying to be a better person. And honestly, I think he would have succeeded in that if it wasn't for Calypso. So once again, all these stories, I think, challenging a lot of the stereotypical notions that are held in superhero comics, mainly through changing the way that Peter Parker interacts, because he feels pretty jaded in a lot of these. And I really enjoyed that, like, turning on its head of the traditional superhero canon, and these were really interesting comics to read.